Chapter 1. The Woman Who Came from Words. The afternoon fell softly over the town of Parity, with a melancholy grace. The sky, painted in hues of gold and lilac, embraced the colonial rooftops while the distant sound of waves marked time more precisely than any clock. It was early autumn, and the air carried a slightly humid breeze, scented with sea salt and damp wood. On a cobbled street lined with a garden long untended stood the house of Gabriel Leal, a writer, a widower, and someone who had willingly been forgotten by the world. Gabriel spent most days in that old mansion, where silence was broken only by the creaking of the floorboards or the rhythmic tapping of his vintage typewriter, an heirloom from his father. Books piled up around him like literary walls, and the yellow glow of a worn lamp cast lazy shadows on the walls. Yet that day, the air felt heavier. Something hung in the atmosphere like a whisper not yet spoken. For weeks, he had struggled to start a new book. His past novels had seen moderate success, but since Marina's death 2 years earlier, he had withdrawn into words as if escaping a fire. Writing was his last link to reality, and even that had begun to slip. Until yesterday. The night before, Gabriel had a vivid dream. In it, a woman walked through mist-covered trees, barefoot, in a flowing light dress, her wavy brown hair cascading naturally over her shoulders. She said nothing, but her gaze demanded to be told. Upon waking, he sat at the typewriter without hesitation and began shaping her presence. Elena Duarte. That was the name that came to him, as if it had always been there. And with it came stories, traumas, gestures, thoughts. A woman who loved photographing storms, who always carried a poetry book in her bag, who spoke to flowers as if they might answer. Each detail flowed effortlessly, as though he were transcribing memories rather than inventing them. By mid-afternoon, Gabriel took his usual walk to clear his thoughts. He passed through the cobbled streets, ignored curious glances from townsfolk who hadn't seen him out in ages, and reached the harbor. That's when the unease began. Sitting on a bench by the sea, a woman read a blue-covered book. He barely noticed her at first, until the way she tucked her hair behind her ear caught his eye. The gesture was so familiar it stilled him. He moved closer, cautiously, and for a moment saw her face. His heart stopped. It was her. Elena. Or someone identical to the woman he had just written that very morning. He froze. Maybe it was coincidence. Perhaps his weary mind had latched onto someone he'd seen in passing. But there were too many details. The way she crossed her legs, how she stared into the distance as if living in two worlds. It didn't make sense. It wasn't possible. That night, he reread every word he had written. Her dress, the earrings passed down from her grandmother, even the half-smile she wore when thinking of something quietly amusing, all of it was there. All written before he ever saw her. And then he read the last line he had typed. She sat by the sea, holding a blue-covered book, waiting for the world to say what had not yet been said. It was the very scene he had just witnessed. For the first time, Gabriel felt afraid of what he had written. And one quiet question echoed in his mind. What if she knows she was written? Chapter 2. Invisible Traces. The next day dawned wrapped in mist, as if the town wished to hide its own contours. Gabriel woke earlier than usual, restless, with the sensation that the walls around him had drawn closer during the night. The image of the woman at the pier, Elena, or someone identical to her, not only disturbed him, but demanded answers. For the first time in years, he felt that his words had crossed the limits of fiction. He wandered the house in silence, poured himself nearly cold coffee, and flipped through the notebook where he jotted down fragments for characters and stories. Among sketches of unfinished plots were faces, maps of fictional towns, disjointed lines that would never become novels. And now, a woman who existed without ever being real. He tried to rationalize what had happened. Perhaps the woman was just similar. Perhaps his mind, steeped in solitude, had projected her onto a stranger. But the coincidences were too many, too precise. He had to investigate, even if it meant confronting the impossible. He bathed, dressed in a linen shirt, and walked quickly toward the town center. He passed the newspaper stand, nodded to tourists who snapped pictures without watching their step, and entered the small bookstore run by Donna Rosa. She greeted him with her usual motherly smile and perceptive eyes, but quickly noticed something had changed. Carefully, she mentioned seeing Gabriel at the pier the day before. Then, before he could respond, she asked if he had met the misty woman. The phrase, spoken so simply, hit like thunder. Gabriel masked his surprise and asked her to explain. Donna Rosa, used to stories that challenged the ordinary, said she had seen a woman sitting on the pier many times over the past few weeks. Always alone. Always reading the same blue-covered book. According to her, the woman had a strange presence, not frightening, but misplaced, as if she didn't quite belong to that time. More surprisingly, others had noticed her too. No one knew her name or where she came from. Some thought she was an artist, others a traveler. But there was one detail that left everyone unsettled. The woman never spoke to anyone. Not even a glance into others' eyes. Gabriel left the bookstore with his mind spinning. The idea that she had already been there before he started writing made everything more unsettling. How could he have created someone who already existed? Or, even more disturbing, was he somehow accessing fragments of a reality he didn't understand? Later that afternoon, walking near the main square, he entered a small cafe he used to frequent with Marina. He sat by the window and pulled out his notebook. He needed to document every detail, every sensation. Not as fiction, but as if investigating a real case. As he wrote, he overheard a quiet conversation between two older women at a nearby table. One mentioned the girl in the abandoned mansion, claiming she had seen lights inside at night, though no one had lived there for years. Gabriel leaned in and asked cautiously where that mansion was. They pointed to an old house on Rua das Palmeiras, surrounded by tall trees and windows veiled by unmoving curtains. Curiosity ignited in him like fire on dry cloth. That afternoon, he walked to the mansion. It was grand, partly hidden by climbing plants. The iron gate hung slightly open, and the garden looked recently tended, despite the overall appearance of decay. Through foggy windows, he could make out the vague shapes of furniture covered in white sheets. Nothing suggested life, and yet, the house felt alive. That night, he reread the chapters about Elena. It felt like each paragraph contained an echo of a larger truth. Then he noticed something. He had described Elena's past as an orphan raised at a place called Santa Emilia, in a fictional mountain town named Vila de Serra. For some reason, he searched online. To his astonishment, a real orphanage by that name had once existed, closed over 30 years ago. Old photos showed children in plain clothes gathered before a stone building. And in one image from 1989, a girl with large eyes and wavy hair stood out. Gabriel leaned in closer. It couldn't be, but it was her. Elena. The same woman he had seen at the pier. The same he had described before ever seeing her. The same now smiling shyly in a real photograph from decades ago. His entire body went cold. He felt like he was standing at the edge of something vast, as if his words were shaping reality or awakening something forgotten. Before sleeping, he looked at the last page he had typed. At the bottom, he had written a note, one he didn't remember adding. She remembers who she is, but still doesn't know why she came back. Chapter 3. The Diary of Someone Not Yet Born. The road toward the countryside twisted through mountains veiled in low clouds, like layers of silk laid gently over the landscape. Gabriel drove with his eyes fixed on the asphalt, though his mind wandered through far more uncertain terrain. The name Santa Emilia still pulsed in his thoughts like a distant echo, and the image of the girl in the photograph, so strikingly similar to Elena, refused to fade. Each kilometer was a step closer to an answer he wasn't sure he wanted. According to a faded forum post, The orphanage had closed after a partial fire in 1993. No one had lived there since. Yet some vague visitor reports described toys left behind, old drawings on the walls, rooms frozen in time as if awaiting return. Upon arrival, Gabriel saw a stone building partially swallowed by creeping vines. The facade showed cracks but stood firm. The main entrance was sealed with rusted chains, yet a side door hung ajar. Through it, he entered a hallway littered with leaves and the scent of ancient mold. Silence filled the air like dust. He stepped into the main hall. Rows of tiny chairs still faced a dusty blackboard, as if the children had been called out mid-lesson and never returned. Gabriel scanned cabinets, half-open doors, windows letting in shy slivers of light. In a back room, he found the remnants of a library. Broken shelves, scattered books, torn pages. Among them, a thick navy blue notebook lay atop a toppled chair. Dust blanketed everything, but this notebook had aged well. When he opened it, he discovered a diary. The first pages were ordinary, likely penned by a teenage girl who once lived there, accounts of daily life, meals, friendships. But as he read on, the tone shifted. The writing became symbolic, introspective. The author, who never signed her name, wrote of recurring dreams about a man by the sea, always writing on an old machine, surrounded by books and solitude. She described his silent voice, sorrowful eyes, and how it felt like he was speaking to the paper instead of to the world. Gabriel froze. It was him, or rather, the life he now lived. The diary had been written before he was born, yet here were fragments of his existence, foreseen by a mind far too sensitive for linear time. The girl also wrote of feeling perpetually out of place, like she didn't truly belong in that orphanage. She described a sense of waiting, that her real life hadn't started yet, that her name, her identity, her story, belonged to another time. One of the final entries read, "If I ever return, I hope he recognizes me, even if he doesn't know why." Gabriel's hands trembled. The diary, the coincidences, the woman at the pier, all of it wove together into an invisible thread where the impossible wasn't just possible, it was necessary. For the first time, he didn't feel like the author of the story. He felt like its vessel. At the very end, one page had been torn out, leaving only the jagged edge behind. Traces of blurred ink hinted that something had once been there. And on the inside back cover, a note written in a different hand, more mature, more recent, stood out. Time does not separate what was written to be reunited. He left the orphanage in silence, the sky now overcast, and the rain beginning to fall with weight, as though the world wished to cleanse something invisible. Gabriel drove back to Parody under clouds and questions. That night, he returned to the typewriter. The last page still held the line, "She remembers who she is." He now added, "She had been here before, long before me, and still she waits." Chapter 4. The gift from a past he never wrote. The rain didn't stop all night, hammering the roof of Gabriel's house like a persistent memory. The orphanage, the diary, the photograph, all of it seemed ripped from a meticulously crafted plot. But he knew he hadn't written any of it. Not like this. The sense that he was part of a much larger narrative, one beyond his grasp, grew stronger. For the first time in his life, the writer felt like a character. The next morning arrived with a pale light filtering through the curtains. Gabriel moved slowly through the house, still caught in the gravity of what he had discovered. The silence around him felt denser, almost expectant. When he entered his study, he froze. There, resting atop his desk beside the typewriter, was something that had not been there the night before. A handkerchief, delicately embroidered with blue thread. The initials ED adorned its corner. Elena Duarte. It was unmistakable. The fabric carried a soft floral scent, jasmine, perhaps, and had been folded with a precision that suggested care, even ritual. Gabriel stood still for several minutes. That item was not his, and the house had remained locked since his return. The handkerchief shimmered slightly in the morning light, as if holding a memory. When he touched it, cold and smooth, an image surged through his mind. Elena, lying under a tree, whispering a name he couldn't hear. It was as if the object had brought a piece of her into his space. Driven by a need to understand, Gabriel searched the house for anything out of place. In a forgotten cabinet in the living room, he found something even more disconcerting, a brown envelope addressed to him, in his own handwriting. But he had no memory of ever writing it. Inside were typed pages, yellowed with time. A passage from a novel, apparently written years ago, after Marina's death. The scene described a woman who entered the protagonist's life bearing silent answers. She spoke little, but her presence altered everything. Her name in that draft wasn't Elena, it was Clara, but the soul was the same, a woman who seemed to come from another plane, destined to pull him back toward the light. Gabriel didn't remember writing it. It felt like something he had channeled, long before it could make sense. At the bottom of the final page was a handwritten note in a rushed, shaky script. When she returns, don't question. Just write what she remembers. The rest of the day was a blur. Gabriel couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, not in a sinister way, but with a kind of silent tenderness. That evening, while staring into the gray garden, he heard something. A faint sound from the yard, like leaves being touched by bare feet. He opened the back door cautiously. The garden, still wet from the rain, smelled of fresh earth. And there, resting atop the stone wall, was a photograph. He picked it up. It showed him, Gabriel, sitting at his typewriter. Behind him, a blurred figure stood behind the curtain. It was her. But he had never taken that photo. His breath caught. The photo was real. The moment had happened. Yet it was impossible. He returned to his study, placed the handkerchief on the desk, the mysterious photograph beside it, and sat before the typewriter. Then he wrote. She left the handkerchief so he would know she was near. And when he was ready, she would return, not as a memory, but as fate. Chapter 5. The Witness of the Unimaginable. The following days were wrapped in silence and expectation. Gabriel walked through the streets of Parity with sharpened senses, as though each corner might hold a clue, as if the walls of the town could whisper answers. Elena's presence lingered, delicate, constant, like a fragrance that refused to fade. He had carefully stored the embroidered handkerchief between the pages of the orphanage diary. The impossible photograph now stood framed on his bookshelf. He didn't understand how it existed, but he accepted by now that logic alone could no longer explain anything. He needed something deeper, something beyond reason. One cloudless afternoon, he visited an antique shop tucked in a narrow alley near the square. The place, dusty and filled with forgotten objects, was owned by a refined old man with perceptive eyes, Jonas Malheros. Gabriel only knew him by sight, but had always sensed the man saw more than he let on. As he entered, a strange chill passed over him. Something in the room pulled at him. He browsed for a while, aimless, until a wooden shelf drew his attention. There, resting quietly, was an empty picture frame, identical to the one now holding the mysterious photograph in his home. Jonas watched from a distance. Then, approaching, he said softly that he had been expecting Gabriel. Gabriel, confused, asked why. Jonas explained that a long time ago, a woman had left something in his care. A box, small, made of dark wood with copper inlays. She hadn't given a name, just instructions. One day, a man named Gabriel Leal would come looking for it. And when he did, the box should be given to him, no questions asked. With trembling hands, Gabriel received the box. It was warm, as though it had just been touched. Inside, he found several old letters, handwritten and weathered. Some were addressed to him, Gabriel Leal, with dates from years before he was born. The handwriting was delicate, feminine. He opened the first letter. The writer introduced herself only as E, and spoke of recurring visions, a man by the sea, writing on a typewriter, surrounded by books and silence. She claimed to feel his presence across time, to know he would endure pain, isolation, and search for meaning in words until one day, he wrote her. She didn't ask for anything. She simply told him, "Write. Because in writing, we will meet again." Gabriel's chest tightened. These letters weren't just messages. They were evidence of a connection impossible to explain. One letter ended with a line that burned into him. "If you're reading this, it's because we've already met, even if your heart doesn't know when." Jonas then spoke again. His voice was low, but firm. He said he had met Elena, or at least, a woman who called herself that. She had come to Parody around 1984, young, quiet, with eyes full of time. She told Jonas she needed to leave something for someone who hadn't arrived yet. Jonas, skeptical then, had kept the box out of curiosity. But she had never returned. He also confessed something more. 4 years after that, Jonas dreamed of her. Always silent. Always near the sea. Now, seeing Gabriel, everything finally made sense. Gabriel left the shop with the box clutched to his chest. His thoughts were racing. Time was no longer linear. The past shaped the present. The future whispered to the past. Elena existed in everything. In the unspoken memories of others, in forgotten objects, in gestures that made no sense, until now. That evening, back in his study, Gabriel opened one more letter. Inside was a drawing. It showed his living room, just as it was now, down to the smallest detail. At the bottom of the page, in tiny handwriting, a single note. "I'll be here. When you believe." And as if the world were listening, a breeze passed through the room. And once more, that faint perfume of jasmine returned. Not memory. Not imagination. Presence. Chapter 6. The words that wrote themselves. That night, the city seemed to have retreated into itself. The cobblestone streets lay empty, street lamps casting amber halos over wet stone, and a cold wind descended from the mountains like a silent omen. Gabriel felt it, something approaching. Not hope, not fear. Certainty. As if every fragment of this impossible story was about to align. He was in his study, windows open, lights off. The moon poured silver light into the room. On the desk lay the relics of this journey. The orphanage diary, the embroidered handkerchief, the photograph that should not exist, and the letters dated before his time. Then came a sensation. Not sound, not movement. A shift in the air. The kind of presence one feels before seeing. He turned slowly. And she was there. Elena. Not a dream, not a vision, not a memory. She stood in the doorway, whole. Her light dress shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Her wavy brown hair framed a face that carried centuries in its eyes. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Gabriel stood frozen. Not in fear, in reverence. He felt something inside him awaken, like a name remembered after years of silence. She stepped forward and extended her hand. When they touched, warmth surged through him, as though a part of his soul, long dormant, had returned to its place. Then she spoke. Her voice was gentle, steady, yet vast. She said she had crossed time not because he had written her, but because he had forgotten her. That their story was older than paper. That they had been tied together before ink ever touched a page. She had come back because he was finally ready to remember. But for her to stay, something would have to be left behind. The writing. The words that had connected him to the world, that had kept Marina close, would need to cease. Because as long as he wrote, Elena would remain only a fragment, a reflection. To make her real, he would have to choose life over language. It was a cruel choice. To abandon writing was to let go of his identity, his solace, the bridge between his grief and his survival. But to continue writing meant Elena would fade back into the margins. She reached into her dress and pulled out a silver pendant shaped like a feather. She placed it in his hand and said nothing more. The gesture carried the finality of a vow. If he chose the writing, she would disappear. If he chose her, she would remain, not as character, but as woman. As now. That night, they didn't speak again. They lay side by side, not as symbols, but as souls. And in the silence, Gabriel began to understand. When morning came, the bed was empty. Only the feather pendant remained. And on his desk, a single page had been typed, but not by his hand. You may keep writing. I will live in every word. But you will not see me. Or you may silence the page. And I will remain beside you, now and always. Choose what is true for you. Even in silence, I am with you. Chapter 7. The Blank Page. Dawn arrived gently, painting the sky in a pale blue that slowly dissolved into gold. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the slats of Gabriel's study window, casting long shadows over the books, the floorboards, the worn edges of memory. The house, as always, was silent. But this silence was different. Full. Gabriel woke with a strange weight in his chest. Not sorrow, not fear, but a stillness he hadn't felt in years. The air still carried that delicate scent of jasmine. He reached toward the other side of the bed, expecting to find her warmth still there. But the sheets were empty, cold. He sat up slowly. The room bore no trace of her, and yet everything felt altered. The blanket was folded. A glass of water stood half full. And on the nightstand lay the feather-shaped pendant, exactly where she had placed it. She was gone, but not lost. He moved to his study. There, at the center of the desk, was a single sheet of paper, freshly typed, its edges still curled from the machine. Gabriel hadn't written it. He read, "You may continue to write, and I will continue to live in every word. But you will not see me, or you may set down the pen. Let silence speak, and I will stay beside you, as flesh as now. Choose what is truest, for I am with you, even when unspoken." There was no name, just a single thin line at the bottom, like a horizon between two worlds. Gabriel sat motionless for a long time, staring at the page, his mind drifting between memory and moment. He thought of childhood silences, of Marina's laughter, of the first time he touched a typewriter, of the day he dreamed of Elena, or perhaps remembered her. He thought of the stories still unwritten. And then he thought of her hands, her eyes, her voice, not as dialogue, not as prose, but as breath. He picked up the pendant, clutched it in his palm, and stood by the window. The sea shimmered in the distance. The town yawned awake, unaware of the decision being made inside that house. The waves came and went. The light warmed the floor. He walked back to the desk, took the typed page, set it aside, inserted a new, blank sheet into the typewriter, and did nothing. 4 hours. The machine remained silent. At sunset, he rose, closed the cover of the typewriter, and placed the feather pendant around his neck. For the first time in years, he stepped outside without a notebook, without a pen, without his grief. On the cobbled street, bathed in golden light, she waited. Elena. She smiled, not like a character, but like fate fulfilled. And Gabriel returned the smile of someone who had finally written what needed to be written, even without a single word. End.